Okay, it's time to share the results. I went over it several times, checked all my notes, made sure this was correct, and here we go. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and the results might shock you. I'll have a final conclusion in writing at the end of the video also. If you're just catching this, make sure you check out the Blackworm Food Experiment playlist. You can see exactly how things went for yourself. So here's the results. Enjoy.
All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're unraveling a pretty wild biological mystery. We're going to break down a meticulous, months-long experiment designed to see exactly what happens when you try to push blackworm regeneration to its absolute maximum capacity. But what actually happened was incredibly counterintuitive. We're going to explore how feeding these aquatic worms more high-quality protein actually left us with less worm mass at the very end.
So, the question at the core of today's chronological thriller is actually super counterintuitive. Can feeding your worms way too much high-protein food literally starve your culture? Common sense tells us that more high-quality food should equal more growth, right? Well, as we're about to see, aquatic ecosystems definitely don't always play by the rules of common sense.
Let's set the stage. The setup here was perfectly controlled. We had 5 identical breeder box systems, and each one was loaded with exactly 7 grams of clean worms. That gave us a grand total of 35 grams of starting biomass. Importantly, all of these boxes utilized mature mulm, marine pure gems, and sponge material to act as the biological processing layer for the whole ecosystem. And finally, we introduced our core variable, 5 different high-protein foods.
We're talking about a really intense protein load here. We used extremely nutrient-dense inputs like Hikari carnivore pellets and a few different formulas of Fluval bug bites. These were specifically chosen because of their high animal protein content and really rich amino acid profiles. You know, the fundamental building blocks you need for cellular regeneration.
And at first, it looked like a total, unequivocal success. During those early days, the worms were showing incredible feeding responses. They were consuming the food so rapidly, and we saw this explosive early growth and regeneration, especially in System 1, which was the one getting the Hikari carnivore pellets. Everything was going exactly according to that more food equals more worms hypothesis.
But let's look at the timeline, because things went off the rails pretty fast. Everything started beautifully on day 1, and by day 10, the growth was just fantastic. But right around week 3, day 23 specifically, a really dark turn occurred. The worms in System 1 transitioned from calm, anchored feeding to absolute frantic chaos. By day 41, this erratic behavior began spreading to the other systems, and we were forced to completely pause all feedings.
Now, I want to be really clear about what erratic behavior actually means here. This wasn't normal movement. The worms were flailing, actively abandoning the substrate, and exhibiting this super frantic surface movement. The crucial point is that this flailing wasn't just them being active eaters, it was a blaring distress signal. It painted a very vivid picture of an ecosystem rapidly falling out of balance.
To stop a total, catastrophic crash, we had to step in. Feedings in System 1, which was the most chaotic system by far, were totally paused. Meanwhile, the other systems kept getting their daily pellets. This pause was critical. It basically forced us to wait and observe if the erratic behavior was directly driven by the continuous high-protein food input, or if there was some deeper internal system failure going on.
So after weeks of watching, waiting, and pausing those feedings, the trial finally wrapped up. It was time to separate the worms from the substrate and find out exactly how much biomass we had actually generated. But the final forensic weigh-in revealed a staggering, paradoxical twist that absolutely nobody saw coming.
You guys, these final numbers are just wild. Every single box started with exactly 7.0 grams of worms, period. But Box 1, our explosive early grower, it ended up at just 3.2 grams. That is a loss of nearly 4 grams. Even the absolute best performing boxes, numbers 4 and 5, dropped down to 4.6 grams. Despite consuming all these high-protein diets designed for maximum regeneration, every single system lost a massive amount of weight.
When we tallied up the whole shebang, the total was honestly pretty sobering. Out of the impressive 35 grams of clean blackworms we started with at the beginning of the month, only a meager 20.8 grams were recovered at the end.
We're literally looking at a 40% drop in total worm mass across the board. All that high-quality protein, all that initial amazing feeding response, completely vanished. The systems didn't just fail to grow, they actively shrank.
So this leaves us staring straight at the paradox of plenty. How is it biologically possible that pumping an aquatic system full of high-quality amino acids resulted in starvation and weight loss? If they were eating the food, where in the world did all that energy and mass go?
Well, the answer means looking at the whole ecosystem, not just the worms. You see, blackworms don't just eat the pellets directly. They actively graze on the microbial layer, the bacteria, the fungi, and the protozoa that actually break the food down. The extreme protein load we dumped into the water completely overwhelmed the limited amount of mature mulm we had in the boxes.
Here's the breakdown of how that biological layer totally failed. The worm population simply grew too large for the mulm to support. The worms started eating the edible microbes way faster than those microbes could reproduce. Without enough microbes to process the food, the leftover protein turned into toxic dissolved nutrients. And the worms, now basically starving for those microbes, diverted all their energy away from growing and into frantic movement, desperately competing for a depleted food source.
Disrealization? It's a total game changer. If you do not feed and maintain that underlying microbial ecosystem, the mulm and the biofilm, the worms will ultimately crash, regardless of how much premium, high-protein food you drop in there. You aren't just feeding worms, you are feeding an ecosystem.
Now, to be fair, we do have to talk about a huge physical variable that threw a wrench into the data: the sponge variable. Seeking refuge in grazing material, the worms heavily colonized the protective sponge filters inside the boxes. They got so deeply embedded in there that removing them safely was physically impossible.
Think back to box 1 for a second. It recorded the absolute lowest recovered weight at just 3.2 grams. But visually, it clearly had the largest number of worms hopelessly trapped inside that sponge material. This tells us our recorded weights on the spreadsheet represent the recovered biomass, not the actual true total biomass left in the system.
But listen, even when you factor in those hidden worms in the sponge trap and the starvation issue from the depleted microbial layer, we still have a massive missing piece of the puzzle. We still have to solve the mystery of why the worms were practically jumping out of the water in a complete panic. Starvation alone doesn't normally cause that level of erratic flailing.
And here is our incredibly strong clue. Blackworms don't have lungs, right? They breathe directly through their skin, which is coated in a delicate, protective mucous membrane. When that microbial layer was overwhelmed by the high-protein food, it caused massive, toxic nitrogen spikes in the water. Those chemical spikes literally burned away the worm's protective slime coat, essentially suffocating them.
Which brings us to a really grim realization. The flailing, that erratic surface behavior, the fragmentation. It wasn't some hyperactive feeding response. It was an agonizing, energy-draining attempt to escape a toxic environment where their skin was burning and they literally could no longer breathe. They were trying to flee their own ecosystem.
But hey, science never stops, right? The autopsy of this great food trial hasn't just given us answers. It has directly paved the way for a brand new experiment that is actually already underway to test our new theories. We're calling it the stone structure trial. We are basically taking everything we learned and aggressively refining the setup. First, those problematic sponges, completely removed so we can get 100% accurate final weights. We're replacing them with physical stone structures just to see how the worms anchor. And most importantly, we are drastically dropping the starting mass from 7 grams down to just 1 single gram per system, completely preventing that immediate biological overload.
So, the stage is completely set for our next explainer. The new experiment is already underway to narrow down these variables one by one. And because we now have that strong clue as to why the worms acted so erratic, those brutal toxic nitrogen spikes, we drastically lowered our starting mass. Will controlling this biological load finally unlock maximum growth? You'll have to join us next time to find out. Thanks for learning with us today.
Hope you enjoyed the summary. And here is
All right.
the written description so you can see it for yourself. And if you're not on the Discord channel, check it out. You can see how this experiment went in details, and all the notes are there. Check everything out about this experiment, past experiments, and all future experiments. Give suggestions and do your own experiments. Join in on this Blackworm discovery journey together. The link is in the bio for the Discord channel. Let's continue exploring Blackworms like never before and understand them in a completely different way.